Welcome to Authors Alcove for Fantasy Writers. This is episode 26 of the Story Savvy series, where Rebecca, the developmental editor with Heartbound Editing, is helping me self edit my good story into a great one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can also join the Authors Alcove community on Patreon or check out the new membership site at authorsalcove.com. And if you go over to authorsalcove.org, we do have a summer book giveaway. Some of the books I want to show off is Unmasking the Curse. This was by Shel Cypress. I have interviewed her a couple times, and she even was one of our Meet the Author book club. And she sent me my own copy plus an extra of her novella. So I'm going to give one of the novellas away. This is about a side character of the other book, and I am doing them separate. And then, of course, I have to plug Rebecca's book. This is also on our summer book giveaway, A Heart of Flame. This is my copy, so not the copy I am giving away. But yes, excellent.
It'll look the same.
Yes, it'll be the same. It will be a hardcover as well. Anyway, so last week we went over integrating and checking subplots and plot threads, and I still had plenty of questions. So I am glad that we're going to be able to cover some more of those questions. But today we're actually going to be taking a look at when, where, how, and why to tie up those plot threads and anything else to you set up, foreshadowing or seeding as well.
Hello, hello. Last week was fun, and today is definitely going to be a continuation of that. Yeah, we're going to talk about deciding between wrapping things up or leaving them open, depending on what the element is and what you are going for. By the end of this episode, the hope is that you will feel confident finding everything that this topic applies to in your story and have an understanding of the pros and cons about wrapping something up or leaving it dangling.
So, picking up where we left off in the last episode, is tying things up always the right thing to do? If not, how should we be deciding if we should or what or not?
Essentially, no, it is not mandatory that everything gets wrapped up, and it's not always the right choice. Some of the situations in which it isn't is if doing so would make your resolution way too long. You don't want to have chapters upon chapters upon chapters after your climax just to get everything wrapped up. The second scenario in which that's not ideal is if you have a series that you're trying to carry things over for. If you have a standalone, there is a higher expectation of wrapping things up, but if you have a series, there's a lot more wiggle room there. And then the last consideration here is just how much emphasis that you put on setting things up or seeding or foreshadowing. If you put a lot of emphasis on setting them up, you need to put a proportionate, if not equal, amount on wrapping things up. If you didn't, if that's not the kind of story you're telling, where you're putting a lot of effort into planting clues and things, you can get away with leaving a lot more dangling. This is a topic where I really, really want to remind folks of a point that you've brought up in a few episodes, which is any of the self editing that you need to do related to this topic is likely a matter of adding or tweaking one sentence in the resolution of your story. So the entire section of the book after the peak of the climax. These should all be quick and easy fixes with plenty of wiggle room about where exactly you implement them.
So you just mentioned series, and I know my own book is a series. So I have a question on that. If I set up or foreshadow something, and like right now I'm finishing up the first book, and there's definitely foreshadowing stuff there, how can I most effectively make sure they are not forgotten by my reader when they go to read later, both in the book where I set it up and also in the book where it finally pays off?
In the book where you first set it up, I recommend above all else that you mention it once, maybe twice, in the last couple of chapters. And this can be a very passing mention. It just has to be thought of or mentioned or seen, something like that. In the book where it pays off, make sure that you are seeding it in that book too. This came up in the Deus Ex Machina episode. If you've seeded something in, let's say, book one in a series, you have to also seed it in book four where it pays off. You can't rely on your readers having read, let alone remembered, that seeding in book one. And if you, like I just gave in this example, if you have multiple books in between, then I suggest mentioning it at least once in those in between books just to keep it established as part of the world or plot or character build or whatever that happens to be.
So, when we choose not to wrap up something, what are some best practices around that? And does it change if it's like a series and a standalone?
Like I said, it does. If you are writing a standalone and you choose not to wrap something up, I recommend either using that very intentionally and making it clear in the way that you deliver it, hey, I'm intentionally leaving you with all of these questions, or doing what you can to show, well, the protagonist also has these questions dangling. The protagonist can't get the answer to this question, so you don't get it either. But very intentionally addressing it is even more important in a standalone than in a series. So, looking at both and now shifting over to series a little bit more, again, make sure that the protagonist can't get the resolution that you want to withhold from the reader is definitely the best approach there. Another approach would be to mention the thing in the lack of closure to show that you didn't just forget about it. That can be very important in showing that it was an intentional choice rather than, oh, this author isn't a very good author, they just forgot to wrap this up. And then lastly, make a note to make sure that you follow up on whatever that was later if it's a series. If you seed something in book one and you have this thought at the time of, oh, I'll pay this off in book four, go have a note for book four and write it in just, hey, remember to follow up on XYZ.
And one of the things when you said that when it's a standalone, to make sure that it's done intentionally. One of the books that came to mind, I had to, if you saw me like typing, I was trying to remember what it was called. But The Giver. And like, there's other books like that where they intentionally um, leave questions, and You're supposed to close the book and think about it. And if it's done well, you will be thinking about that book for a very long time afterwards. But I know there's also times when it's not done well. And for example, I can think of a book that you in particular were very annoyed by. I don't know if you can think about it, where the person did not tie up. And I think that word intentional is probably like
Yeah.
key as far as especially standalone.
Yeah.
But like, let's say if we do want to tie up a subplot or all of our subplots, what is the best way to make sure we tie up all of the loose ends and don't leave any loose, such as, certain books?
Yeah. I am going to recommend that you list all of these things. I know I recommend lists a lot. I love lists. I think they are great. So I suggest specifically for looking at wrapping these things up. Name what the thread was, or the plot, or the seed. Name the core moment. What were you setting up with that plot? What were you setting up with that thread? And then list and check all of the events or questions that you used to set it up, checking that each thing on that list, or at least the biggest, happens or gets an answer. So if you're setting up an event in this thread, how you check to make sure that it's wrapped up is make sure that that event you were setting up actually happens. If the seed was, oh, I wonder if, or what about so and so, then you make sure that that thread got wrapped up by making sure that an answer is given, ideally clearly and ideally memorably. That's how you check that these things got wrapped up.
So I know that for myself, like when I put a seed in, like I will take notes to try to keep track of that. And is there a better way, or what way do you choose to use to make sure that you're keeping track of all of your seeds and all of your subplots? Would you recommend taking notes, planning, drafting?
You can First of all, you can take notes wherever works best for you. For some people, that's spreadsheets. For some people, that's physical notes. For some people, like me, that tends to be Word documents or Google Docs. The important thing is that you remember where you wrote all of these things down and ideally try to keep them together in one place. It can be harder to keep track of if you have a bunch of different notes across a bunch of different platforms or medias. Yeah, so there isn't one right way that I'm aware of. Keeping lists is how it's done, unless you're a genius with perfect memory. And yeah, I tend to make these lists in my outlining document so that I have it collected with all of the other back end information for a series. So the information that's for me, but not necessarily for the reader. And in that, I personally keep three very specific sets of lists. The first is about my characters. I have a character roster, sometimes it might be called a character Bible or character sheets. And in this, I have their name. I have any old names that I used to think of them as when I was drafting, because sometimes those slip through and I need to search for them. I have notes on their specific mindset, so their internal what's the word I'm looking for? Like landscape. Is this person generally optimistic or pessimistic? Are they outgoing or introverted? That sort of thing. And then I will also list their skills, their change arc, their magic color, things like that. The second list set that I will include has to do specifically with the arena, so the physical space that the story is playing out on. And this might be notes that I collected from researching Stonehenge, or a link to a Pinterest board with pictures of buildings that I want to describe in my writing, stuff like that. That same list also includes my overarching themes. So, my statements like, I am writing in a modern equivalent Roman themed world. My books are generally this tone, and I want to have this effect on my readers. And this emotion is always going to be at the center of my stories, those sorts of things. And then the third set of lists that I will keep for tracking these plots and plot threads and everything is specific to plot points and events. So this is where I would list things like, all right, at the beginning of book one, this is the climax event. Okay, well, that has five different elements that all need to come together for that event to happen. All right, I'm going to list all five of those events and I'm going to list all of the places where I threaded those through. So this element comes up in chapters 1, 6, 9, and 15. That kind of stuff. So while I'm drafting, I will tweak this. I usually make the list when I'm doing the plotting and the outlining so that I can make sure I'm planning to put these things in. And then when I'm drafting, I will reference those lists now and then to make sure that I'm keeping things cohesive and on theme, and to make sure that I am bringing these things up where and as often as I intended to. And then during self-editing, I might rearrange or change my mind on things, add, scrap, or reposition elements in those lists. It's also the lists that I use when I am checking my subplot and plot threads. Though, given how I outline, that's often just a quick mental check for me to make sure, okay, I meant to mention it here, here, and here. Did I? Yes. And then if I'm not sure, I will go in and check. But this is usually a quick process for me because I do so much of that work in the outlining.
So when we're talking about things to wrap up that aren't really big enough to count as subplots, what exactly do you mean by seeds? Is that the same as foreshadowing?
It can be. I tend to use those two terms very interchangeably. The the consideration here is that a subplot, like I'd mentioned in the last episode, has a genre attachment to it. So you can have an adventure subplot, you could have a romance subplot, you could have a maturation subplot. Those all speak to a bigger understanding of the conventions, the expected moments, the emotions, all that kind of thing. When I'm talking about seeds, which sometimes I'll refer to as plot threads, but the seed is just kind of the beginning of the plot thread. What I'm talking about is the first time you mention Chekhov's gun, for example. You mention the gun that's going to go off in the midpoint, whatever. So the mention of that gun the first time is the seed. And then every time you mention it again, or allude to it, or hint at it, or question things around it, that's all growing that seed. So the seed is simply whatever you plant with the intention of later harvesting it. And the harvest is when you have the gun go off, or when that ability that was such a pain in their butt in chapter 5 that they've slowly been trying to work on comes into itself and can be used productively for what they want to use it for. The idea of a seed is that it seems unimportant at the time that you plant it. That's not necessarily a requirement, but it's a common trait to it. And you plant it specifically with the intention of being able to harvest it later to give the reader an enjoyable moment. That's all that really is. It's a seed if you set it up, and then later the reader gets a little bit of a hit off of it from whatever emotion or sense of mystery or surprise or whatever that payoff was.
How can I make sure I paid off all the seeds in my book, or do you have a recommendation to make sure I did not neglect any?
Those list suggestions can be helpful, but the seeds can also be small enough that that can be really hard to spot. So I recommend that as you're doing a read through of your manuscript, of which you should do many in the self-editing process, when you see a paragraph or a sentence where you know that you were planting a seed, pause for a beat and just think, oh, did I pay that off? And name where in the story you did, or if you aren't sure, go check where you think you might have done that. Beyond that, try making the list. Check each one, name where you think it paid off, go check that with fresh eyes if you can to make sure that it's going to come across how you intended. And how you define whether or not that seed paid off so that you have an answer there is it paid off if it changed how the protagonist thought, saw the world, or continued pursuing their goal. It paid off if it created emotion for the protagonist and, by extension, the reader. And lastly, it paid off successfully if the story wouldn't be the same without it. And by it, I mean the seed and the thread and the payoff.
So, as a writer, I think we know what our story should say. And so it's very easy for us to overlook the fact that our planted seed had never sprouted, or because in our mind it did, because we know what it was supposed to do, even if we forgot to do it on paper. And then subplots was wrapped up because we know more than the reader and all of those sort of things. How can we catch these?
So, mostly outside feedback. This is one of those things where because we thought we paid it off or we intended to, it can be really hard to get out of our own perspective. Beyond that, it just goes right back to those lists. And if you can point at a passage where you're like, yes, it paid off right here. This is the end. This is the wrap up, the tie up of this particular plot thread or seed or whatever. That can be helpful, but it may or may not come across that way. So get alpha readers, get beta readers, get a dev editor, get ARC readers, whoever you can find to be those fresh eyes for you.
So we do need to wrap up. I have one last question for you. So I know that not tying up a big seeds or major subplots can feel very unfulfilling. I remember one of our Meet the Author book clubs, I kind of referenced before, you had felt as you were beginning the book that they were doing such an excellent job of setting something up. But when we got to the end, you felt it never paid off. You felt very confused and disappointed because you felt you were almost tricked in a way.
Mhm.
So I know we need to be careful not tying up seeds, but I do have to ask, just like in the subplots, is it ever okay if we don't harvest a seed?
Yes, but the same rules apply. So, going through a brief little list here, mention it to show that you didn't just forget to pay it off. If the protagonist never gets an answer to whatever you'd set up, name that. Have the protagonist have a moment of going, wait, I never got an answer to that thing. And then lastly, really look at it. Look at if you are delivering the core emotional payoff promise of your story. If you aren't, in the end, and I recently edited a book where this was an issue, so it's top of my mind at the moment. But if you reach the end and you are any degree, be that one sentence or more, shy of giving the reader that catharsis or that breath or that relief, whatever your promised emotional payoff is, then you do need to pick a plot thread, ideally your main plot thread, go back to last week's episode, that would deliver that emotion and tie that up enough to deliver it. In the book that I just edited, it was literally a matter of one more sentence because it was a great thriller. It built up, it built up. The lady is opening her husband's bedroom door to see if she successfully poisoned him or not. And the book ends without giving the reader either a sense of justice because she failed and now she's going to go to jail, or catharsis because he was an asshole and now she's free of him. It was one sentence shy of delivering an emotional payoff, and that matters. So, to that extent, you do need to pay stuff off.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. I feel like the biggest theme here is that we need to be intentional.
Yeah,
Anyway, so thank you so much. I have been enjoying this series so much. I really am enjoying this particular section the most, just because this is where I am in my own self-editing process. Again, thank you.
excellent. Yeah, next week we will continue in the very similar themes, so hopefully it will continue to be helpful. And we are going to do the first of two genre-specific episodes focusing on fantasy and magic systems specifically. So, for right now, I would like to thank everyone who has followed along with this series. We would appreciate it if you could please like and subscribe to the Heartbound Editing Podcast and the Authors Alcove Podcast, where you can find lots more content for fantasy authors and readers beyond this joint series. Thank you very much.
And I am actually completely geeked about next week's episode. See you then.